All right, class, today we are going to talk about our technique lecture number 2, the squat movement pattern and the step or step up movement pattern. These are both semi-unilateral movement patterns, but these have a greater transfer to sport, however, less loading capabilities compared to our bilateral counterparts, the squat and hinge patterns. So there are benefits, there are drawbacks. Start thinking through these after you've already watched our technique lecture number 1 on the squat and hinge pattern. Think about some of those similarities, some of those differences, and how we can get really some more transfer towards our athletic potential within our sport. So first, we'll look at the lunge pattern. Okay, this is a disassociated leg position. So one leg is moving in one direction while the other is moving in the opposite direction. We can load this in many different ways. We can load it axially. We can load it with hand loading capabilities. We can use any other implement we so choose. But we're looking at this disassociated leg position. We can have a lifted back leg. We could have a lifted front leg. We can move this not just in the sagittal plane, we can move in the frontal plane, transverse plane. There are many variations for our lunge position. If we look at the step position, this transfers best towards our running or sprinting technique. It is very similar position of this extended hip with a flexed hip position. So rather than having an overly extended rear leg, as we see in the lunge, which we also have a bilateral movement where our one foot is on the ground and the other foot. With the step up position, one foot is being loaded and it is completely unilateral for a portion of the exercise. So we're getting some more dynamic activity. We're getting some more unilateral aspects, which is going to give us maybe some more transfer towards our sporting activities. The lunge position, so we talked about our squat and our hinge, how we rotate around the x-axis, so forward, backward. With the lunge, we rotate around the z because one leg is moving forward as the other leg is moving back, which is going to rotate the pelvis in the transverse plane, or spin it as if it's a top and we're rotating around that center axis, the z-axis, up and down. With our step, we are rotating around the y-axis or the frontal plane. So one side of the hip is moving up as the other is moving down as we lift our knee into flexion, or moving our hip into flexion. We also are extending our leg into more of that same extension we see during straight standing, but we're moving into the frontal plane by lifting the pelvis up and down. So we hit all three axes with our three primary lower extremity movement patterns: hinge, lunge, and step. With the lunge position, we don't want our feet in a straight line. We want to be closer to our squat stance position, so it's a slightly wider foot position. We can use a forward knee position, and we can use a more straight up and down shin position. So the angle of our shin is going to dictate the load placed on the quadricep musculature, the knee musculature. It's also going to see if we're transferring more towards maybe a front squat compared to a back squat. Similar transfer or in similar comparison. If we're looking at a more athletic lunge, we're going to use the more vertical shin position. If we're looking for more transfer towards maybe our front squat, a weightlifting position, we're looking for that forward knee position in our lunge, maybe, which does add into a little bit more adductor strengthening on the posterior and the forward leg. We can look at them as different variations. But with our athletic lunge, we're going to have a more vertical shin. We're going to move the hips down in an athletic lunge. We'll move them forward if we're doing that forward knee position kind of lunge. Similar with our breath, if we're axially loading, we want to use that Valsalva maneuver. Otherwise, we can really control our breathing throughout the movement, depending on where we want to focus on intensity, bracing, loading. Our arm position is going to be dictated based on how we place the load. So if we're using an axial load with a straight barbell, we're going to want to hold it similar to our back squat, and maybe a slightly wider arm position to allow more control of the barbell. If we're using maybe a safety bar, which is going to allow the barbell to stay on the shoulders without holding on, we can use a hand-supported lunge where we are holding another object to add another point of stability, allowing us to increase the load we can move within the movement pattern. And then lastly, with our back, we know that the pelvis is going to slightly rotate. We want to make sure that we're keeping as upright a torso as we can in our athletic lunge and our knee forward lunge, unless we are focusing on a more forward tipped lunge position. In most cases, we are going to use a more upright torso, unless it's something like a rear foot elevated lunge or a hand supported lunge. We may have a more forward trunk lean. Think about it as based on the variation you're using is going to dictate your trunk position and your knee position throughout the movement. With our step position, we want to use that same deadlift position that we start with, our hips or our feet underneath our hips, and then we lift our foot onto that box that we're going to use. The box height is determined by the intensity that we are trying to focus. In most cases, a 12-inch box is sufficient, a shorter box. If we're really trying to work on greater range of motion at the hip, we'll use a higher box. But if the box height is forcing the athlete to use their grounded leg to assist in lifting the weight, we know that that box is too high. So we want to only use the foot that is on the box and the limb that's on the box as our driving force to move the resistance vertically. We want to also use this as a hip loaded position. So we're trying to pull with our foot, pull with our heel so we can load the posterior chain and lift the barbell, unless we are using a more focused knee forward, more knee dominant step up variation, like maybe a side step up that allows for greater amounts of forward knee translation, greater ankle range of motion, higher box. Maybe we use that knee forward position, but that's a slightly different variation. Use your same breathing procedures as if you are performing your lunge. The more loading you're using, the more breath you're going to need for stabilizing. And your back should stay in an upright torso position predominantly, because this is really working on those mechanics that we see in running and sprinting. We're going to keep that upright torso posture as much as we can. We don't want to lean into the step up. So if we forward lean into the step up, we are actually increasing the momentum, changing the leverages on the hip and the knee. If we can keep that upright torso, we can really use the hip musculature to pull our body up onto the box rather than having to use the knee musculature to really push into the box to lift us straight up. It changes the focus of where the demand is being placed on the body. Assign your demand and your execution based on what you are trying to achieve with your variation. So now let's go through our setup and execution of our athletic lunge. I'm sticking to our athletic lunge for our best transfer for our athletes. So with our lunge position, I'm going to use a barbell lunge for our demonstration. We would load the bars similar to our back squat position, step out a little bit farther, and when we load our lunge position, we want to have that upright torso. Our posterior leg should be directly into hip extension or full extension, directly underneath the torso, underneath the barbell. Our foot is similar to when we're sprinting. We're getting that ball of the foot, loading the ankle musculature, loading the foot. Our front shin is more on a, let's say, a more vertical shin position. Our knee is similar to that in our squat position, where the knee is over the midfoot, the instep, similar to our sprinting mechanics or stepping mechanics. This is really our way to train the posterior chain most efficiently, is by keeping that vertical shin. The range of motion of that lunge, you don't have to have your knee touch the ground. Some athletes may be able to. I cannot. If I go further, I'm going to lose position somewhere else. So keeping our range of motion dictated by our posture. If I have to lose my torso, my upright torso, I have to lean in, I have to lean forward in order to allow further range of motion. If I lose spinal stability, if I move laterally with my front leg or my back leg, it's going to be a compensation that's not going to allow me to use the resistance I need and to develop what I'm trying to develop. So Keep an upright vertical shin, use the range of motion that that athlete can achieve, and progress them to about a knee an inch above the ground position. If your knee is hitting the ground every single repetition, you're likely not controlling or eccentrically loading that resistance well enough to stabilize. We want to get just above the ground to force that control and force that transfer back into the concentric portion of the lift. Okay, this is a barbell. Technically, this is a barbell drop lunge. So we are using a forward step with a reverse pushback. Would be this specific exercise. You can also turn this into a walking lunge. You can add stepping variations depending on the version of the lunge you are trying to achieve. So unrack the same as we do for our back squat. Step in, we have that forward toe position, knee over the foot, tracking in line in our squat stance. And we are keeping that vertical shin, vertical rear leg, vertical torso, loading the posterior chain. Okay, with our step variations, we use a shorter box in most cases. We're going to rack the barbell similar to our back squat, step forward toe, vertical shin, and pull our way up. Okay, and we pull and step with a step up at the end of our step up movement. So by performing the hip extension into a hip flexion of the contralateral limb, this is most similar to what we see in sprinting, bounding, skipping, athletic movements. We are always going to use that high knee position to give us our best transfer. Okay, it is more dynamic, forces unilateral balance, and forces that same extension and flexion contralateral pattern that we see in sport. Okay, so think back to our topics for discussion. Similarities, differences, cues, progressions, benefits, muscle actions, periodization, and programming. Think through these and ask our questions when we start talking. I'm going to give us some regressions, progressions, and variations for our lunge in multiple planes. So with our lunge variation, it is of a more athletic movement compared to the squat. The squat is more load conducive. The lunge becomes a little bit more athletic of a variation here. So with the sagittal plane, we have a progression of lunging. Okay, this is the progression I use with my athletes to build range of motion as well as build our movement pattern menu. I'll likely use this often with athletes that have already followed a linear progression with a standard walking lunge. And then we can start performing these variations using the barbell. So for our sagittal plane, we have the front foot elevated split squat, which allows for greater range of motion through the hip and the knee on the front leg, adds for a more straight in line rear leg. The split squat is think of our lunge, but we don't have to move our legs. We're already in that lunge position. We're just moving up and down. Rear foot elevated split squat puts more load on the front leg, a greater torque, as we can see here, this bottom picture. More of that torque is on that front leg because we've lifted the rear leg up. It's more similar to a squat pattern for that front leg. The Bulgarian split squat is a much higher lifted rear foot elevated split squat here, where we are really not using that posterior leg. It's almost a single leg squat variation. It's kind of that tie-in between the lunge and the squat movement pattern together is the Bulgarian split squat. Then we have front foot elevated lunge where we step onto a lift, walking lunge where we step into the lunge and then we step into the next lunge. We don't want to have in between steps with the walking lunge movement. We want to step and move right into the next lunge, forcing us to pull and then land. The difference between our split squat and our lunge is the acceleration of our body moving towards the ground. So we have to absorb not just our own body weight on both legs, we also have to absorb our acceleration moving towards the ground. Gives us a greater transfer towards athletic movements because in athletic movements, we have to absorb our acceleration towards the ground. Reverse lunge is similar to a Bulgarian split squat, but we're just stepping back into the lunge. Drop lunge is what I showed you in our demonstration. And then we have rear foot elevated lunge where we would start on an elevated surface and step down onto the ground in that lunged position. So this is a progression that allows for greater loading and a more anterior to posterior chain development. Front foot elevated split squat, front foot elevated lunge are more anterior chain focused, as opposed to rear foot elevated variations, and standard lunge variations are more hip dominant within the movement pattern. From the frontal plane, we have things like the Cossack squat, which is where we start in a split stance position and lunge in both directions. So this isn't our true just sagittal plane movement like we see before, but these are lateral movements, which if we look at things like change of direction, we need to be able to move laterally and produce force laterally. Lateral lunge, we would step into that same lunged position where one leg is in one direction, the other is in the opposite, and we are producing force back towards the center. And then the lateral lunge with the slider, we would keep a slider under that foot. It's more of a single leg squat variation, similar to our Bulgarian split squat when it comes to demand. The Curtsy Lunge, we step behind in this lunge. It's a rotation, but it's a more transverse plane movement pattern. We're moving the pelvis in the transverse plane and loading the limbs in a more athletic movement pattern than strictly just the sagittal plane. And then we can move into multiplanar movements where we have open lunge, where we are stepping directly to the side and moving a mix of a lateral lunge with a forward lunge, 90-degree or 45-degree lunges where we're stepping 45 degrees to either side. We can start adding in more multiplanar variations when we have built a foundation of sagittal, frontal, and transverse plane skill. Now we can transfer to mix our planes together. With the variations of the step up, I'll look also through different planes. Sagittal plane, we have our front step up, which is our standard step up that we used in our execution. This has very similar movement patterns to sprinting and bounding, how you see here, where we are still in that same step position, but now the velocity is the focus as opposed to the load. With the transverse plane, we can do things like a crossover step up or cariokas, where we're doing a lateral running or rotational running component. Frontal plane, we have side step ups where we have to pull the body into the laterally within the frontal plane. Great for adductor development, similar to things like lateral running, lateral shuffling, similar to these step variations. And then we can use multiplanar variations like the open step up, where you turn one foot 90 degrees and step up and rotate, doing different rotational step ups where you maybe mix a crossover step up, but you have to rotate 90 degrees and rotate back up onto that step. And also this transfers towards multiplanar running, where you are running forward, running laterally and transferring lateral movement into linear movement, into rotational movement. We are moving these all together. With the regressions and progressions for the step up, we have a simple progression for the movement. So we start with our foot on the box and we step up. So from a lifted foot into both feet on the box, and then we step back down. Then we move to starting with the foot on the box, and then we have that contralateral step, or that high knee that I showed in our exercise demonstration. Okay, that's our next step. Then we have the step up, where we start with both feet on the ground and step onto the box and step all the way. And finally, we do our full movement progression, which we step up into a contralateral step, and then that contralateral step moves back to the ground, and we move both feet back to the ground, as you saw in our demonstration video. That is the final progression of the step up movement progression. With overload, we can always manipulate box heights and implements to vary the velocity, the load, the range of motion at each joint, and really train specifically for what we're trying to do within our sport. And these transfer to sport and health in multiple ways. Sports require lunging, stepping, and moving in this disassociated limb position, rotating the pelvis in space. When we climb stairs, we perform that step pattern. When we get up off of the ground, we come from that lunge pattern if you're kneeling on the ground, and you have to use that lunge pattern to return to a standing position. These have transferred to life and health not just sport performance. All right, think through our topics of discussion for our lunge and our step, and we can have our discussion to really get this application so you're ready to utilize this within your training programs. All right, thanks for watching.